Good evening. Today I'll be discussing the effects of caffeine on sprints with short recovery. To start off, my name is Garrett. I attend Gallo Magnet High School, and I am currently undecided on my college or major, but I plan on running at the Division I collegiate level and figure out my major along the way. I chose this topic because it is a personal interest of mine. I start every morning with a cup of coffee, and I run with the Gallo track and cross-country team every afternoon after school. I believe this is a very important topic to discuss because many athletes, including myself, consume caffeine without knowing the potential risks that go along with its consumption. Some athletes will even consume caffeine before a race in hopes of making them feel faster and stronger. However, caffeine is known to affect every consumer differently, which causes confusion of whether athletes should consume it or not. I hope that my study will inform athletes both the positive and negative effects of caffeine consumption. Before I conducted my experiment, I researched studies that also use caffeine in sports, and I discovered that ergogenic enhancers of caffeine include decreasing fatigue and increasing speed and endurance. When caffeine lowers fatigue, it causes the participants to feel as if they are not putting in as much work, which causes these stronger results, especially in sprinters. In one study, they found that caffeine reduced the fastest sprint time in the initial stage of the test by offsetting the overall increase in fatigue. This meaning that caffeine reduces the rate at which fatigue increases, causing the runner to feel stronger for a longer amount of time. In another study, they reported that caffeine reduced the fastest sprint time in 30-meter sprints, causing the runner to experience an enhancement from caffeine when compared to their placebo trial. When someone begins to consume too much caffeine, it can lead to habitual caffeine consumption. This will cause a reduction in enhancements over time due to the participants' built-up tolerance. And one study, they discovered that high caffeine users would not obtain caffeine's ergogenicity, which is the main cause of an increase in work. High doses of caffeine tend to enhance someone's performance greater than just a low dose. However, these high doses are the common cause of ill effects such as insomnia, increased heart rate, and nervousness. While on the other hand, lower doses do cause an enhancement in an athlete's performance, it is usually not as much as the athlete may hope. For example, in one study, they discovered that their participants experienced a heightened performance with a low prevalence of side effects after consuming a low dose of caffeine. While caffeine does cause some major enhancements in sports, it can also cause some ill effects to occur. One in particular is increased nervousness. Athletes already experience these nerves before a competition, so consuming caffeine before a race puts them at risk of their nerves growing worse. In one study, they found that higher doses of caffeine are associated with increased nervousness as well as an increase in heart rate. As the consumer's heart rate begins to increase, their performance begins to plateau since they've already hit their maximum pulse. Therefore, consuming caffeine before a hard workout may cause you to gradually lose pace and perform weaker. In previous studies, they reviewed the effects of short sprints consisting of 4 to 12 seconds with a passive recovery. However, none of it to test caffeine on 200-meter sprints with a short recovery. I believe that 4 to 12 seconds does not allow the athlete to hit their maximum speed since most hesitate when the gun fires at the starting line. Therefore, my study will consist of 4 200-meter sprints with a short recovery to determine if caffeine could have any performance-enhancing effects when compared to the placebo. This will not only help sprinters, but also mid-distance runners to determine if caffeine is worth consuming. My research question is, how does caffeine affect a trained runner's ability to tolerate a shorter recovery time between prolonged multi-sprinting trials? This allows me to determine whether caffeine benefits the sprint times with little recovery, which is important since on race day or during workouts, athletes have minimal time to recover before competing. My null hypothesis is, if the participants are given caffeine, their sprint times will be no different with a shorter recovery time. While my research hypothesis is, if the participants are given caffeine, their sprint time will be faster with a shorter recovery time. The independent variable of my experiment is the caffeine or the placebo I'm providing the athletes with. The dependent variable will be their times and if this was affected by the caffeine or the placebo. In my study, each participant will serve as their own control group, so they will go through the caffeine trial one day and the placebo trial the next, depending on what they were given prior. Lastly, my constant will be the distance. Each participant will run 4 200-meter sprints on both trial days. Before I conducted my experiment, I obtained consent from each participant. Then I gathered my materials for my experiment, such as cups, decaffeinated coffee, caffeinated coffee, and a stopwatch. There were 11 participants who showed up to run. Each was a member of the Galileo track and cross-country team. On test day 1 of my experiment, caffeine or decaffeinated coffee was given to each participant randomly. They ran a 10-minute walk to the track and completed their sprints in groups. After each sprint, the participants' times were recorded. Also, before and after each sprint, the participants' heart rates were recorded. Once everyone had completed their sprints, they ran back to the school and completed their usual stretches to avoid injuries. This same process was repeated for trial day 2. Lastly, I compiled my raw data and conducted a statistical analysis. The results of my participants given caffeine demonstrates the fastest times were achieved in the initial stages of the test, especially sprint 1. The participants' time started out extremely fast, with many of them reporting that they felt like they received a boost of energy. Within the results from the caffeine trial, it is noted that the participants' time started to increase as the participants ran. While some of the participants' times gradually increased, one in particular jumped. For example, their first sprint was 33.4 seconds, while their last sprint was 1 minute and 3 seconds. This demonstrates how caffeine can affect each consumer differently, especially in sports. However, the participants' heart rate seemed to be higher in the initial stage of the test when compared to their final sprints. Heart rates are generally always higher when you start off, but begin to lower after constant practice. And every participant included in this study runs on a daily basis, so this is a normal occurrence. Now for the placebo results. Most of the participants' pace started out at a relatively fast pace, some faster than their caffeine trial results. Within the placebo results, it is noticed that most participants were able to maintain similar pace throughout the 4 sprints. However, one participant was able to progressively get faster after consuming caffeine. Their first sprint was 32.8 seconds, and their last sprint was 27 seconds. During the placebo trial, the participants' heart rate seemed to grow gradually and not jump like in the caffeine trial. The results of my experiment demonstrates the various effects that caffeine can have on different individuals, especially in sports. I found it interesting that caffeine did not cause any major enhancements in the participants' performance. However, I believe this could have been caused by the athletes feeling more comfortable with my experiment on the second day, since this was many of the fast times were achieved. Past research had similar findings involving the effects of caffeine. Higher doses are associated with increasing faster burnout, but also enhancing an athlete's performance. While lower doses do cause an enhancement, it also causes less ill effects. For example, in one study, it was found that every participant but one experienced an enhancement in their performance. However, in another study, they found that there was no significant difference between the caffeine and the placebo trial results in the 100-meter sprint. My research is framed to reduce any implications or unreliable results. However, some limitations include the weather, sample size, and the amount of caffeine consumed by each participant daily. On day 1 of my experiment, the weather was sunny and warm. However, on day 2, it was cold and rainy. My sample size is another limitation since there was only 11 participants who showed up to run. This small sample size makes it difficult to represent a large population since there was little variety. Lastly, each participant consumes a different amount of caffeine daily. This causes caffeine to affect each participant differently, especially in those who do not have a tolerance for caffeine. Therefore, they will be the ones who feel most energized by consuming caffeine, but feel more affected by it after. Future research should make their main focus on making sure their sample size is larger, as well as the distance the participants have to run. For example, there have been many studies done consisting of short all-out sprints, yet little to no studies involving anything longer like the mile or the 5K. This can help business runners to determine whether caffeine could benefit them in their distance events rather than just the all-out sprint. While completing this experiment, I learned a lot about planning and time management. With my team's busy indoor track schedule, it was very important for me to plan ahead to make sure that my experiment would not hinder the plan my coach had made for the week, especially during those that we had indoor track meets. Now, I would like to thank Mrs. Long for helping me throughout the year with my experiment, my coaches, Mr. Bryant and Mr. Carter, for letting me conduct this experiment and letting me use a team, Ava Ray for taking pictures, Sophie Markowitz for helping me keep track of times and heart rate, and to my participants for staying positive and showing up to run on both trial days. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes, Ms. Brown.
Did your research indicate an ideal consumption time prior to performance?
Ms. McGraw asked if my research showed any ideal time to consume caffeine, and yes, it was shown that it would show the most effects if you consumed it 30 minutes or an hour prior before running. Yes.
Out of your 11 participants, were there different groups in regards to like people who normally consume caffeinated beverages versus people who rarely consume them? Did you have a mix in that 11?
Mr. Taylor asked if I had a mix in the 11 participants that I had, and I think so because a lot of them they'll bring like Dr. Peppers to school every day, or a lot of the girls will have like Starbucks or some type of coffee source. So I did take into account, but they weren't separated into groups.